Hello. Here we are at week 29 of our journey through the Word, and this week we begin our week with the murder and the killing of James, the apostle, John's brother. And this was the first apostle to be martyred for Christ. And we find that it pleased the Jews so much that Herod decided he was going to work his way through them, and so he has Peter imprisoned. And as we read the story and we see the miraculous release of Peter, it's this release of Peter that I'd like to look at a little more in detail, because there's much that we can learn from the release of Peter. We find, first of all, that when the angel brings Peter out of the prison, he gets him out of the prison and then he leaves. And here Peter is standing there, and the angel is gone. Why did the angel just leave? You see, the angel knew what Peter would do. God knew what Peter would do, and God knew where Peter would go. And so where does Peter go? We're told that he goes to the house of a woman named Mary. Her name is Mary, and she's the mother of John Mark. What we can learn by this is that Mary most likely is a widower, and she is a Jewish woman. She is a believer, and she has a son. But her husband is we can assume, I think we can assume pretty positively, that her husband is dead. It wouldn't be referred to the house of Mary if her husband was still alive. And also, we know that her son, John Mark, is a part of that household. We can also make a positive assumption that Peter is well known to the people that have gathered in Mary's house, and that they know Peter well as the apostles. And so Peter goes to her home, once again, a home that he knew very well. And when he comes there, we see that they are praying for him. Prayer vigil is going on for his safety and for his release. And as we continue to read it, we find that there are some other clues that are given to us. Not only is Mary the mother of John Mark and well known by Peter and by the apostles, we also find that Mary is the aunt of Barnabas. We read this in Colossians when we are told that Barnabas is John Mark's cousin. Some of the translations you may read, you may find that it says that John Mark was the nephew of Barnabas. But if we look at that word, anaposis, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. Greek is not my language. But this word literally means the child of one's uncle or one's aunt. And so we know that John Mark's mother, Mary, would have been Barnabas's aunt. We also know that the age gaps in those days was much different than what we generally have today. And yet I see this even today, that age gaps between uncles and aunts, they can vary greatly. I can give you an illustration of that even in our own family. My granddaughter married a young man named Brian, and around the time that Brian and our granddaughter Logan got married, Brian's father also remarried. Our granddaughter and her husband Brian had a son, and shortly afterwards, Brian's father and his new wife had a daughter. So our great-grandson is a little bit older than his aunt. And so for Barnabas to be much older than John Mark is not a stretch at all. And we will see as we continue on that we know definitely that Barnabas was an older man. As we pick up from last week, we saw that Agabus had come and given a prophetic word about something that was going to happen and a famine that was going to happen. And so as a result, the church in Antioch began to collect monies, and it was Paul and Barnabas who went to Jerusalem to deliver those monies. And we're told, as we look at our readings this week, that while they were there, they picked up John Mark in Jerusalem and brought John Mark back with them to Antioch. When they returned to Antioch, we find that there are 5 teachers in Antioch. The church was structured much differently than so many churches in the church today. I love seeing when churches develop teaching teams. That's the way the early church was. And the church in Antioch had a teaching team. They didn't hear one person over and over. And so as we look at the teaching team, we find that Barnabas and Saul, Paul, were 2 of the 5 of that teaching team. And we see that the Holy Spirit instructs the leadership team to set apart Barnabas and Saul and send them on this first missionary journey. And so they prayed over them and they sent them out. And we also find, as we continue reading, that they took along John Mark as their helper. It's important for us to get to see this young man and to watch the development of him as we continue on. I'm putting a map for you to be able to download. That is the map of their first missionary journey. So you might want to take that map and follow along as they go on their journey. And you're going to find out, if you follow that map, that John Mark deserts them pretty early in their journey. We are going to find out that when they came to Pamphylia, that this is where John Mark deserts them on the journey. As they continue on the journey and visit numerous cities, they come to one city called Lystra, and it's here where we begin to see the dynamics of the team, this missionary team that went out, Paul and Barnabas. And we also get a glimpse into who Barnabas was and see him as an older statesman. Because in their time in Lystra, this is where the people there begin to cry out that Barnabas is Hermes and Paul is Zeus, and they liken them to 2 of their gods. Who is Hermes? Hermes was the chief god. And so they look at Barnabas as an older statesman. He is the older chief god. And Paul, they called Zeus, and who was Zeus? Zeus was the chief spokesman for the gods. And so we see that Paul was the one who became the vocal spokesman for the team and who was the one who would stand before them and present the messages that they brought. When they complete their missionary journey, they come back to Antioch. And when they come back to Antioch, they share the events of the journey. You would think that there would be such rejoicing and excitement, and for many there was. But there were the brethren who came from Judea, who brought dissension. Who are these brethren from Judea? These are believing Jews. These are not the unbelieving Jews. These are Christian Jews who came down from Judea, and when they heard what Barnabas and Paul, particularly Paul, Saul, who had been teaching, they took issue with it. They said, you need to be teaching that they have to be circumcised. And Paul certainly wasn't teaching circumcision, nor was he teaching that they had to hold to the old law and all its rules and regulations. And so these believers who were Jews who came from Judea took issue with them. And there was great dissension then. And so when Paul and Barnabas and the church in Antioch said, we need to have some concrete rules, you have to stop and realize that this was a great time of transition for the church. How does the old law play out in the new covenant? These are 2 men who had a great humility about them. And in spite of all that they had accomplished, they were willing to take their message and submit it to the elders who were over the church, over the early church, and submit it to them to bring correction if it needed to be corrected, and yet to bring that stamp of approval and authority if they felt it was the message that God was telling them to speak. And so they go to Jerusalem and deliver the gospel and said, here's what we are preaching, and this is what happened when we were going to the people. Thank God for the experience that God made sure that Peter had as the leader of the church. Paul was able to say, I can vouch for the message that they are taking because of what Paul did for me when he sent me to Cornelius in Caesarea, and the Spirit of God came upon them, just as you're hearing Paul tell you. And so God made sure that there was a witness of what God was doing, even amongst the apostles. And so we see that a letter is written for Paul and Barnabas to take back to the church in Antioch. And not only do they send a letter with them vouching for the message that Paul and Barnabas was taking, and also giving them some guidelines and instructions. They not only sent the letter, but they also sent witnesses who had been witnesses of the deliberations that had taken place at the council in Jerusalem. And so they sent along two men who would be to be witnesses. They sent along Judas, also known as Barnabas, and a man named Silas. Both of these men, it tells us that they had a prophetic word that they would bring. Now, we've done some things with prophecy that have caused us to look at a prophetic word more as fortune telling. There are times when the message of God will foretell something in the future, but the word prophecy that's used doesn't mean telling the future. It means a message that comes directly from God. And so we see that both Judas, Barnabas, and Silas were men who would hear from God and knew how to deliver that message from the very heart of God. After it says they gave lengthy message to the church in Antioch, then we see that they go back, and it says they went back, and yet Silas stays. When it says that they went back, what we know by that is that Barnabas and Silas were the witnesses that were sent, but they brought an entourage from Jerusalem with them. It is my belief that this is when they were back in Jerusalem and came back to Antioch with the message and with these men, that a part of that entourage was also John Mark. We know that John Mark is in Antioch when the second missionary journey begins. We also look at the details of this second missionary journey. This time, it wasn't God who came and said, I want you to set apart Barnabas and Saul. This time, Saul, who is now being called Paul, goes to Barnabas and he says, I feel that we should go back to the churches that we planted and encourage those new believers. I'm sure this was something that Barnabas quickly grabbed onto, because that would be the nature of Barnabas, wanting to encourage and to help these new believers. And so Barnabas was ready to go. And so as they began to prepare the journey, Barnabas says, I think we should take along John Mark again. Well, we see the dissension, and it says it was no light disagreement. It was a strong disagreement. that they had overtaking John Mark. I kind of wonder what John Mark must have been feeling at the time, knowing that he was the very crux of this strong dissension between them. And so we see, as a result, there is a complete split between Barnabas and Mark. We see that Barnabas takes John Mark and he says, I'm leaving, and he leaves. And we're told that he takes John Mark and Barnabas goes to Cyprus. We also see that Paul chooses Silas and that the church prays over Paul and Silas. We don't read that they pray over Barnabas and John Mark. So I think it's a safe assumption to see that Barnabas takes John Mark and he leaves. Paul and Silas take the route that goes up through Syria. Once again, you may want to follow this on the map. We see Barnabas go right to Cyprus, which would be, that would seem logical to me, because remember, Cyprus is where Barnabas was born and where he was from. Now we see Paul and Silas go through Syria and then through Cilicia. Also a logical pathway, because that's where Paul was born, in Cilicia. So we see this dissension and this split. And we have to ask ourselves, was this a permanent thing? Did Paul and Barnabas continue to have this split between them? And what about poor John Mark, a young man who on their first journey wasn't very mature? Did he ever mature? Was there ever any reconciliation in this whole upheaval and this whole mess? The beautiful part, as we continue on and journey in the Word, we find that, yes, there was definite reconciliation between Paul and Barnabas. We see in this second missionary journey, Barnabas goes to Corinth, a place where Barnabas and Paul hadn't gone on their first missionary journey, but we see Paul and Silas go there on the second missionary journey. We also see Paul go to Colossia. And as we read the letters to the Corinthians and also the letter to the Colossians, we find that Paul mentions Barnabas to both of those cities in his letters, and he defends the ministry of Barnabas. And obviously the church in Corinth now knows Barnabas very well, as does the church in Colossia. And so obviously Paul had recommended the ministry of Barnabas to both of those cities, and he defends the ministry of Barnabas to both of those cities. We also know that there was great reconciliation between Paul and Mark. This young man, John Mark, when we look at the second letter that Paul wrote to Timothy, and he's requesting Timothy to come to him. And in his request to Timothy to come to him and to also bring certain things to him, and we know that Timothy was as a son to Paul. There was such a love that between Paul and Timothy. And as he writes to him, he says these words as we read 2 Timothy 4:11. He tells Timothy, pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he's useful to me for service. What amazing words. Pick up Mark. I have need of him. He's useful to me. So we see a whole different heart change and attitude of Paul towards Mark, and he sees the value of who John Mark is, and that he is now matured. We also see in the letter that Paul writes to the Colossians. In Colossians 4:10, Paul says these words. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas's cousin Mark, about whom you've received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And so we find that when Paul is writing to the Colossians, Mark has come. And Mark is a part of Paul's ministry team there as he's writing this letter to the Colossians. Thank God for the maturity of John Mark's life. And you know, are we aware that this young man, as he has matured, that he continues to speak the message of Jesus Christ, even to this day? Because as we will find out as we continue our journey and we come to the book of Mark, the book of Mark was written by John Mark, one of the four Gospels. It's John Mark who pens that book. And so we will learn a lot about the heart of this young man who now has matured and become useful not only to Paul, but he's become useful to us as well. Later on in the week, you're going to meet some other beautiful people, such as Aquila and Priscilla, and a man named Apollos. We'll get to know them more and see the power of their ministry later on as we continue our journey and we come to the city of Ephesus and learn about the city of Ephesus. But I'd like to close my time with you this week as I bask in the knowledge that even great dissension can find its conclusion in great victory. If we are open to the Holy Spirit to teach us, to correct us, to mature us, and to direct our lives. May God give each of us the wisdom and the word that we need to bring health and wholeness first to our own lives and then to one another. I pray you learn much on your journey with Paul this week and with the others God used to change a world. So have a great week. Enjoy your journey.